When his mother died, he masturbated in front of her corpse while his pregnant wife slept in the room next door. Yes. But... Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Better Than Food Book Reviews. I'm your host, Clifford Lee Sargent. Back to it. Okay, so, you probably saw the review before this one, where I mentioned that I'm going to adapt Story of the Eye into a feature-length film. For those of you who have not read Story of the Eye before, or any Georges Bataille, this is the perfect companion piece to it. This is the Biography by Michel Surya. In English, it's Georges Bataille, an intellectual biography. In French, I believe it was Georges Bataille, La Mort et l'Oeuvre. I've gotten like a flood of responses from the video, so I'm gradually getting to all of them, but it's going to take some time. But yeah, if you are interested in being a part of the project, whether you are a producer, an investor, or an actor, or you have some great ideas or something like that, please get in touch with me here. Once again, thanks to the guy who made these shirts. You can purchase them here at this link. I think they're fucking amazing. Laissez-faire, The Headless, The Secret Society, the new religion that Bataille was trying to found that involved human sacrifice, but we'll get to that later. Anyways, okay. Of course, appropriately, it starts off with, his death. And it starts off with this quote by Hegel. "Death is the most terrible thing, and to maintain the work of death demands the greatest strength. On the 8th of July, 1962, a man died. He was buried in a small cemetery at the summit of Vézelay Hill. The austere and inconspicuous tombstone is inscribed Georges Bataille, 1897 to 1962. A name on the tombstone, 2 dates in some books, the remains of a dead writer. Frequently, he effaced himself beneath his books. Sometimes they too vanished. While he lived, no one could completely efface Georges Bataille, yet he was scarcely better known than his books. Today, they are among the most significant. They are also among the most scandalous. While he lived, Bataille scandalized because he discussed eroticism as a dark truth, a truth laid bare, because he also discussed what, as a rule, is, through fear or platitude, suppressed about death. It fascinated him. Dead, Georges Bataille still fascinates. Appropriately. In considering someone over whom silence has fallen, a biography seeks the secret of the fascination his work exerts. This will undoubtedly elude us. The truth of a biography is that, no matter how close it may at times get, in the end, this secret eludes it. It should be condemned to the silence that descends along with the tombstone. This is a truth that is both delicate and heartrending." So with that, here's my favorite biography about my favorite author. Got my cold brew. Let's do this shit. Michel Foucault called him one of the most important writers of the 20th century. The work of Derrida and Baudrillard would never be the same without him. He was once a devoted Catholic, studying to become a priest in a seminary, until this goal was shattered because it was somehow related to a moment when he made a girl cry. So he threw in that towel and took up gambling, Parisian whores, and Nietzsche. Hallelujah! Georges Bataille is not someone I am prepared or even inclined to defend. In fact, to try and defend him, and what I mean by defend is to sort of like rationalize or totally explain his actions, is to try to take away the power of his radical or outrageous thoughts. And his ideas and thoughts were outrageous. The fact that we know about them is just testament to how fiercely opposed to calculation and explanation they remain. They endured, and they will continue to grow in popularity. Georges Bataille's writing is much more emotionally engaging than many theorists or philosophers of his time. Definitely in the Nietzschean vein, although he would never call him... I believe he explicitly stated many, many times that he was not a philosopher because he had no formal training. You can call him a theorist or a philosopher or whatever you want to, but the fact is that he denounced the title. This was a secret man, leading a double life, absolutely. And by most accounts, kind of quiet and seemingly benign. However, what lies just under the surface, the life, the secrets, the writing, the Bataille solar system is one of the most intense places you could ever explore, even translated into English, which is great. Literally every single page of the biography contains some sort of interesting information, anecdote, or story which is written in the most fluid manner, reminiscent of my favorite 20th century literature. Literally every single page of the biography contains some sort of interesting information, anecdote, or narrative written with the fluidity of the greatest 20th century novels. It moves right along, its pacing is balanced, it's respectful and critical where it needs to be. It's illuminating and yet retains the essential mystery of this very special character in French history. For me, as you could probably guess, he's the most interesting mind of the 20th century that I've discovered so far. Up until this point, for all the stuff I've read, he takes the cake. So, there's very little that I can find on Michel Surya, the biographer, in English. But what I can tell you, he was and is a very respected French author. He wrote this in the late 80s under the title, like I said, Georges Bataille, Le Mot et l'Oeuvre. He's the editor and director of the journal Ligne, and he's written quite a bit on transgressive French authors. I came across a piece which was written about Pierre Gouilletat, Mots et Monde. Mots et Monde. Words and Worlds of Pierre Gouilletat. Looks awesome. However lacerating you find Georges Bataille if you want to be physically nauseated and exhausted by text. Check out Pierre Gouilletat's Eden, Eden, Eden. Gouilletat wrote that after trying to desert the army and being imprisoned in a fucking hole. Literally a hole in the ground for 3 months. Hell of a character. I remember seeing Surya in an obscure documentary somewhere on YouTube that was entirely in French, and I can't remember who it was about exactly. It was either like Pierre Klosowski or it was by like Michel Surya, I think. But yeah, if anybody knows what I'm talking about, I don't think it was Andre Masson. I want to say somebody, their name starts with an M. Yeah, but if anybody knows the clip, post it if you can find it. Obviously, he's done an extremely thorough examination and he's excavated all of these delicious anecdotes and stories about his personal life. From those who knew, loved, and hated him. And of course, there's plenty of all three. For as ambitiously intense as Georges Bataille was, the flip side to this is that for a lot of his life, he wallowed in a great deal of self-pity. And sometimes this almost like self-imposed asceticism or martyrdom. It comes with the territory, but as Surya points out, we probably just shouldn't take his word for it that his life was as bleak or filled with injustice as he describes it. By all rights, Bataille seemed to be a master, sometimes intentionally, of self-sabotage. He was all about dissolution, frequently a subject of his writing. But he certainly saw himself and portrayed himself as the victim in many areas in which he certainly was not. This is a fundamental human quality that we employ anytime we're trying to make sense of our mistakes or our shortcomings or our insecurities, or simply when we're feeling guilty, and Lord knows Georges Bataille had a lot to feel guilty about. So the story is filled with great moments of strength and courage, intellectual or otherwise, just as much as it's filled with moments of weakness and absurdity. Maybe it's too much to reveal in a biography. However, at this point, it's not whether or not it's too much. In our case, nearly a century later, it's whether it's interesting or not, and you can call this biography anything, but you cannot call it boring. But never ever fully trust an author like Georges Bataille. It would be like investing in a business venture by Arthur Rimbaud. So Georges Bataille was born in 1897 in Billon, France, to a syphilitic blind father, who played no small part in deeply shaping his mind, which is revealed in Coincidences, which is an afterword to Story of the Eye, and also extensively in the biography. So after rebelling against his secular father and trying to become a priest, he joined the brothels, all the gambling, all of this stuff, and then he started kind of working in and around the fringes of the Surrealists in Paris. So after pissing off the Surrealists, which were led by the moral savior of intellectual virtuosity, André Breton, in 1929 he was once more offered the opportunity to move closer to the Surrealists and to Breton, and to forge allegiance. He declined with a phrase Breton would be unable to forgive for many years. "Don't waste my time with idealism!" I always loved that line. I still do. I employ it at every opportunity. "Honey, would you do the dishes, please?" "Don't waste my time with idealism!" So he became a librarian by day, and by night he was writing these extremely depraved pieces of pornographic literature, if you want to call them that, and all of this radical theory. Another great one of his lines, "System is needed and so is excess," which could be understood that the need for a sustainable model is important, but you must understand the inherent excessive energy in everything, and that energy will need to be used, to be spent, to be sacrificed. He was obsessed with sacrifice. There was a public execution of a Chinese, a Chinese thief or criminal that somebody he knew in Paris had taken these photos of this man being subjected to the death of 1,000 cuts. I think they call it Li Ching. And there was these photos were extremely gruesome, but they absolutely obsessed Bataille because he thought he could see this moment of ecstasy in this little spot between life and death, and this man's expression. The photos are included in the book, and they're fascinating, but of course, they're extremely graphic, so look at your own risk. Nowhere is this better communicated in his later book, The Accursed Share, which is all about political economy and energy expenditure, as it pertains to humans, the sun, the earth, all of this stuff. And those ideas are taken, toyed with, and pushed even further in Nick Land's Thirst for Annihilation. Incredible book. Out of print, I think, but you should try and find a copy anyways. Somebody did message me on Facebook yesterday and they said they found one. I was like, whoa. So, check it out. The apparent simplicity of the Bataillean vocabulary should not mislead us. Bataille's thought, like Nietzsche's, only appears easy. Beneath an exterior of conventional language, Bataille devoted himself to a patient and hieratic work of distortion. As he said and repeated whenever he could, he is not a philosopher, and this denial is partly a matter of tact. It seems that he was often worried he might bore people. Wow. Of timidity, he did not have the right education, as people like Sartre would be quick to remind him. Of course. And a measure of flirtatiousness. Philosophers are old fogies, the cuckolds of a history that can manage fine without them. There was tact, timidity, and flirtatiousness in Bataille's sarcasm towards philosophy and philosophers, yet his position towards them, analogous, or so it seemed, to his response to poetry, would never be clear-cut. But one thing was certain. He was able to adopt more than one notion from philosophy and even from theology that would control the communication of his texts, and do so all the more in that these notions were often used in a way that deflected them from their purpose. Another thing is just as certain. There is a Bataille system. His thought is not as unsystematic as it has claimed. In fact, however carefully he may have tried to give the appearance of complete disorder, his thought was solidly constructed. Would his thought have been held together if this had not been the case? Would not Sartre have needed only a couple of pages to take it apart? Bataille could be justifiably proud of having set up disorder and excess, but he would not have managed this if he did not also have within him the desire to conceive the most solid of systems. System is needed, and so is excess. So it applies to all of his work. This giant contradiction, which makes it endlessly interesting and endlessly attractive to come back to and reread and find all these other things that you missed the first time, which daily, Like I said in the Story of the Eye review, you don't really graduate Bataille, which is great. It's tough. I mean, there is so much to talk about in this man's life and in his writing that, just narrowing it down is impossible. That's like a pun in itself if you've read him. So we'll move on to the scandalous bits. Bataille lived with his mother until he was 31, whom he blamed in some capacity for the abandonment of his father during the war. It was an extremely tragic situation. As Bataille grew up, as he grew up with his family, his father just got worse and worse and worse. He was subjected to the most incredible pain from his condition of, having syphilis that the human can experience. So he was blind, confined to a wheelchair, and going insane. When the bombs started dropping, in 1914, they couldn't leave together. So they had to leave his father in the house. So this was the ultimate abandonment for George. And he never saw him alive again. When he returned, there was just a coffin in the living room. His mother had her own issues growing up, and I think when he was a teenager, she tried to commit suicide. When his mother died, he masturbated in front of her corpse while his pregnant wife slept in the room next door. Yes. But latent quasi-necrophilic incest desires, I don't think it's quite that simple. Nor does Michel Surya. Nor does he think that he was insane, and, neither do I, and neither does he. Yes, I know, but you gotta read the book. If you've never read Ma Mère, and another excellent book by Georges Bataille, there was an adaptation with Isabelle Huppert and Louis Garrel, with the greatest ending that, is basically a depiction of what I just talked about. In fact, I didn't really care for the film. I love both of those actors, but I didn't really care for the film until that very last scene. Literally, the last seconds of the film were perfect. Just perfect. So, I liked that. So the most shocking scene in that film comes from a very real moment in Georges Bataille's life, if we are to trust him, which we should never. But let's, it came up multiple times. He confessed it multiple times. So we're gonna assume, just for the sake of we're just gonna assume it did take place. I masturbated naked in the night before my mother's corpse. This, if it is real, calls for comment, less to diminish its obscenity than to accompany it with its most extreme reasons. What springs up from transgression is located beyond the scandalous, at the same time as it belongs to it entirely. One may kneel and pray before a corpse, what is more that of a loved one. The religious world answers with the attitudes conforming with the significance it gives death, however intolerable the latter may be. And thus death takes on the sense of these attitudes. But one can do more than this. More. And worse. The worst would consist purely and simply of reversing the dilemma we find ourselves in. Was he speaking of himself or creating a fiction? And claiming that the fiction is that which presupposes a God exists who understands the justice which tears are beseeching and the consolation being sought by the kneeling. Of course, the horror of death is real, and so are the tears. But what about kneeling, prayers, or supplication? Insofar as the events recounted 4 times by Bataille, in noticeably the same way, are accurately described, and according to those close to him, it is quite possible to imagine Bataille doing it at that time, their character does not differ substantially from the sacred character of any other, more credible action. Does masturbating in front of the mortal remains of a loved one tear someone apart any less? It is certainly no less of an homage, the homage of a godless man who knows the abyss to which the shrouded body is bound. Jesus. But, and there's much more, but I mean, it's already going on too long. You gotta read the book! So this was right around the time that he wrote Histoire de l'Oeil, Story of the Eye, his most infamous book, which, again, did not actually come out with his name on it until 5 years after he was dead. In 1967. He died in 1962. So let's talk about that for a little bit. Story of the Eye has 3 protagonists in 2 different sections. It's in the first person, like all of Bataille's narrative work, but the real character, the main character, is undoubtedly Simone. There is no doubt that this is above all her story, that of her impossible and divine caprice. She is the source of the character's contagion. Best companion piece to Story of the Eye, especially if you are confused or just want to know more, kind of like want, the weight to set in, if it felt weird or just too juvenile or just kind of like goofy or ridiculous in the first place. Which I guess it probably did not, but who knows. Personally, I find it very interesting and agree with what Surya says about Marcel's suicide in the book. It is wrong to think that there is anything sadistic in the ferocity of the trials she has to endure by Simone and the narrator. They are innocence itself, as in their kids. Her fatal condition is that she was their designated victim. All 3 obey this fate without restraint, carried along by what is illuminating about such a destiny given to desire. It must be followed to the end, right? And now I want to read a little bit from the introduction to the new version, the Penguin edition of Georges Bataille's Eroticism, which is my favorite. I don't know. I don't have a fucking favorite. They're all good. I can't. So in this theory of eroticism, Bataille insists again and again that he is not proposing a work of science, but a religious text which meditates on the fundamental contradictions of existence. As such, it is a text that of necessity engages us at a very personal level, mapping our own experience of eroticism against the abstract truths that Bataille outlines. Much that he says is repulsive. There is a tendency towards a glorification of violence, which is the hallmark of the powerless intellectual. Much that he says is dated. His views on the essentially ugly nature of the human sexual organs seem firmly tied to the bourgeois morality which he attempted to outplay. But in his insistence on the inseparability of taboo and desire, and in his constant emphasis that it is death which is the central fact of human life, eroticism is a text which is ever more relevant to a society which wishes to deny both the forbidden and the mortal. And now we're getting into this because this is the bulk of all the thematic elements of Bataille's work. It's death and sex. Sex and death. His work is so tied up in his life. It's kind of just inseparable from the man and, his secrets. Just why I highly recommend this, because you really don't have this sort of information on other philosophers. You really don't. This is all, it's all secret for most of them. But for Bataille, it's sort of like accessible. It's out there, it's revealed. This is not the easiest thing to describe, but if you want to make some additions or some corrections or something, if I missed something, then you can leave some information in the comment section below, and I'd appreciate it. In Neuroticism, Bataille describes human eroticism, as assenting to life up until the point of death. Okay, so what does that mean? If it doesn't mean like the Freudian death drive, we want to die every time we have sex or something, or it's related to something else. It's the idea that eroticism challenges death in the fusion of two separate, discontinuous beings. Discontinuous as in they are finite and they will die. That's the word he uses. Discontinuous and continuous. And it allows them to reach what he calls continuity. Sort of what is described, or I think of as, the great big back into the energy system. So it's the idea that in its central relationship with human existence, and finite human existence, death, it allows for us to come together, to cross the existential and, kind of physical gulf that separates us. But it is also a very violent movement, a heterogeneous aspect of humanity, which is not necessarily, like I said before, a good thing. And I know that can sound kind of strange, but I'm using that in the way of, what is good leads to life, what is bad leads to death. It's this odd thing, this odd contradiction that seems exclusive to humans. Death is everywhere from the very beginning of Bataille's writing. The idea of freedom and sovereignty in death, and how eroticism relates to all of these. This is Bataille's world. The only sovereign character for Bataille is the one who is not afraid to die, the one who challenges death. Eroticism for Bataille is in the realm of the sovereign. Story of the Eye and Blue of Noon had described how eroticism has no other meaning than what is given to it by death, that it has its obsessive meaning in just this way. The emotional element that gives an obsessive value to communal life is death, he writes. That bit about sovereignty was explained by Sylvain Lotringer. So during the rise of fascism in the 30s, Bataille was on the ultra-left. He was on the side of the ultra-left in various groups. And then in the late 30s, he started this secret society, Laissez-faire, the Headless. The idea was to create this new Nietzschean religion, to found this new religion, and to kick it off, essentially, with a human sacrifice. Bataille had been writing on the Aztecs and all of their, the human sacrifice and its relationship to religion and all of this, the violence of all of it and the intensity is great. But that kind of stuff obsessed him. Remember when I was talking about the public execution and the Chinese man and the death of 1,000 cuts? All that's wound up in his obsessions. So this is one of the culminations of all of these interests. So a woman named Colette Pignon, whose pen name was Laura, was Bataille's mistress at this point. She actually has this is a rare book. I think this is probably out of print, but her collected writings are actually published. It's speculated that she actually offered herself as said sacrifice. She died, and then it is also said that George offered himself willingly as a sacrifice. The problem was not that there weren't any willing victims. The problem was that nobody wanted to kill anyone. There weren't any willing executioners. Laissez-faire, above all, is part of the Bataille legend, one that was all the quicker to develop for being founded on an initial confusion and on a continuing lack of knowledge about its aims and outcomes. I do not think it will ever be possible to resolve this lack of knowledge. Its secret is the key to Laissez-faire. It should therefore be stated at once that Laissez-faire is the name for two things which I do not see as being equal or similar. It is the names of a magazine, which we know in its entirety, and here there can be no difficulties. And it is the name of a secret society, one about which we have very little information. Each participant agreed not to speak about it, and whatever occasional private revelations they have made, no one really broke this vow. Same thing, nobody ever actually revealed him to be the author of Story of the Eye, either. Even his enemies, whom the book repulsed, nobody outed him, even though, they very well could have. So Nietzsche was a big source of inspiration for it. Bataille made a great effort to rescue Nietzsche from the fascists, from the Nazis. because at that time they were just the fascists were championing him, and he was completely associated with them. And I think even like Nietzsche's sister sold out and claimed that all of his ideas were, in the, kind of like in the vein of the Third Reich or whatever. For further reading, check out Bataille's On Nietzsche. Fascism and Nietzscheanism are mutually exclusive, and are even violently mutually exclusive, as soon as each of them is considered in its totality. On one side, life is tied down and stabilized in an endless servitude. On the other, there is not only a circulation of free air, but the wind of a tempest. On one side, the charm of human culture is broken in order to make room for vulgar force. On the other, force and violence are tragically dedicated to this charm. So in 1938, Colette Pignot, the love of Bataille's life up until this point, died unexpectedly of tuberculosis and completely destroyed him. Afterwards, there's a surge of productivity during the war, and it's some of the most challenging material I've ever read. Those were a guilty and inner experience. Bataille successfully prevented Colette's mother from bringing a priest to her deathbed. And after she died, when Colette's mother taunted him, saying there was nothing he could do to prevent a priest from from being at her funeral, Bataille promised her he would show up with a gun and shoot the priest. He did gain popularity in France after the war when he published Inner Experience and Neuroticism. Like I said, all of the scandalous literature wasn't revealed to be his until after his death in 1962. When it all came out, it seems that it had a tremendous impact immediately. Even Yukio Mishima wrote a foreword from Ma Mère. I love that connection. But it all comes to a sad, quiet ending in the last part of Bataille's life. Though he seemed to be a pretty good sport at not being as well known as he may have liked. For as serious as Bataille took many things, too serious as he would claim in old age, in some cases he knew how to have a hell of a good time, at least in the happier days. For the record, this is the only place where I've ever heard of any of these philosophers partying and dancing. And there's one moment where Sartre and Bataille are dancing together at a party with a horse skull stuck on the top of a store mannequin. Happiness, remembering a night of drinking and dancing by myself like a peasant, a faun, with couples all around me. Alone? Actually, we were dancing face to face in a potlatch of absurdity. The philosopher, Sartre, and me. The third character was a store window dummy made out of a horse's skull and a flowing striped yellow and mauve dressing gown, a grimly medieval canopied bed presiding over the fun. I love stories like that. You'd never hear it anywhere else. So for all the talk of sexual excesses and eroticism and the influence of Sade and the orgies and the generally bacchanal things going on in his private life, which eventually turned scandalously not so private after all, I do want to stress that Bataille was not a proponent of the free love, easygoing thing that was taking over around the time he passed away in the 60s and probably started considerably before. He was the exact opposite. It would be safe to say that Bataille preferred to keep things taboo in order to keep their powers of arousal, in order to keep things dirty. Keep it dirty. Don't clean it up. Keep it dirty. I think Michel Foucault would agree. For a long time, an ambiguity has weighed upon Bataille's work. Since his work, as everyone agrees, is one of the most scandalous there is, it contributed to reducing sexual interdictions. This might lead us to assume that Bataille would have applauded the sexual liberation that emerged soon after his death. It had started even earlier. It might even be thought that he would have seen it as the fulfillment of his yearning. This is certainly not so. Bataille's eroticism is black. It is ill-omened and accursed. This is so in a manner that time and a shift in what is acceptable could in no way remedy. Essentially and irredeemably, nothing would ever cure what is born from as eroticism and not as sexuality. Nothing could do so because it draws its dark and wounding character of bedazzlement from death. His narratives all describe the atrocious and holy fever of bodies, debauching themselves only because they are promised to death. They all speak of the fact that there is no reason for loving their ignominious trade, thrown against one another, but the absence of God. Their separation is thus absolute. The absoluteness of the separation of bodies is all that remains of the absent absoluteness of God. When Bataille says our sexual activity finally rivets us to the distressing image of death, or on the contrary, in the same sentence, and the knowledge of death deepens the abyss of eroticism, he places death and eroticism in a double and reversible, yet anguished relationship. Death exalts eroticism, and eroticism renders death desirable. Man. I want to read the rest of the whole fucking chapter, to be honest, but I'm I mean, really, it's a great biography. It is a great biography. It's brilliant. Bataille's book, published in 1957, we're talking about eroticism now, forms part of the first wave of post-war sexual openness. But Bataille stands in complete opposition to any ideology of sexual liberation which holds that all that stands between us and a guilt-free sexuality is the abolition of taboos and ignorance. For Bataille, as for Freud, sexuality is constructed from taboos, and to abolish taboos is to abolish desire. Of course, this may be what we are in the process of witnessing at the beginning of the 21st century. It might be possible to construct an argument that would see the ever-increasing production of pornography as relating to an ever-increasing fading of desire. Depressing, I know. In other words, should you ban pornography to allow for human eroticism to survive? We always want what we can't have, and as soon as you get it, don't want it anymore. For Bataille, the notion that sexual fulfillment resides in the abolition of taboos is a contradiction in terms. For the pleasures of eroticism are the pleasures of breaking a taboo, which is nonetheless acknowledged as such. No taboo, no desire. Human sexuality is constituted by the taboos which surround it so as to allow a world of work and reason to be constructed. It is in that world that we participate as individual and discontinuous beings. Bataille had no wish to deny the fundamental importance of that world. Without it, human society, of course, is inconceivable. What he wishes to stress is that this world creates as its necessary counterpart the world of sex and death, where reason founders. Work evaporates, and the individual and discontinuous beings that we are taste the terrifying pleasures of the continuity of existence. For Bataille, this is the meaning of ancient sacrifice, animal or human, in which by the death of an individual, the continuity of existence is confirmed. This, too, is the fundamental space of religion, a space which Christianity attenuates by refusing to allow the spectators at Christ's crucifixion any desire for the death of the sacrificial victim. Indeed, for Bataille, following Nietzsche, Christianity is fundamentally life-denying in its refusal to allow any reality to the drives which spur us towards carnal pleasure and beyond that to the ultimate pleasure of death. Awesome. Love this introduction. And I'm not sure if this is my other one, but this was Colin McCabe in July 2000. An excellent summary of what eroticism is about. For Bataille, the aim of sexual pleasure is not the gaining but the losing of control. It is the moment of orgasm with the rending of the separate and unified self into a physicality that can no longer be located in one body, which is, for Bataille, the sacrament available in the brothels. This analysis finds real support in the vocabulary of both modern French and early modern English, but sadly not in our modern Protestant English, where a common synonym for orgasm is death. It is this culmination of eroticism which offers that experience of the social, which genuinely unites us with the life of the species. It is this rending orgasm that Bataille seeks everywhere in his analysis of eroticism. The awful daring of a moment's surrender, which an age of prudence can never retract. By this, and only this, have we existed. For many of you, this is not your first rodeo into philosophy, but for those of you who it may be, Bataille is an excellent gateway drug. Not to just all of those who were influenced or championed him, but those whom he found repellent and those who found him repellent. André Breton, for one, those he challenged, Hegel or heralded, Nietzsche, Dostoevsky. This is the wonderful thing about reading biographies like this. We're all social creatures. We've all had some kind of effect on one another. None of these pieces are created in a vacuum, right? Nor were they meant to be solely enjoyed by their creators. Not even Story of the Eye. What can I say? His momentum the energy, his movement, you know, the dynamism, whatever you want to call it, is so awe-inspiring. I mean, it's which communicates so many beautifully contradictive, horrifying, joyful, beautiful ideas that allow you to think very, very differently about the world than you already may. I wish I could have spoken to him. If you donate $1 or more on Patreon, you can subscribe to my vlog, where you can see footage of the original 1928 edition at the Bibliothèque Nationale in France. I took all this video of it with its illustrations by André Masson. It's fucking awesome. Bibliothèque Nationale is actually where Bataille worked. So watch the other review for Story of the Eye. Go pick that up. Go pick this one up. Always remember that life is far too short to read bullshit. Subscribe. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you guys are all very well. And yeah, I'll talk to you guys soon. Have a great night. Ciao.